Rachel sat on the defendant's bench, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, but only one gaze truly mattered, the judge's. When he entered, their eyes met, and the room seemed to freeze. The judge suddenly stopped, and something flashed across his face that Rachel couldn't quite understand. Who is he? And why did her heart tighten, as if they had met before? What do you think connects them? Share your guesses in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how it all ends. Rachel Watson sat stiffly on the defendant's bench, her hands clenched so tightly around the edges of the wooden surface that her knuckles turned pale. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, every stare a weapon aimed directly at her. She could hear the whispers in the gallery, hushed but piercing. She looks the type, they always say they're innocent, how did she even afford a lawyer? Rachel wasn't just on trial for a crime she didn't commit, she was on trial for being herself. The charges were severe: armed robbery and aggravated assault. According to the prosecution, Rachel had stormed into a jewelry store one late evening, brandishing a weapon and making off with tens of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise. They painted her as a desperate woman with a criminal past, someone willing to resort to violence for a quick payday. But Rachel knew the truth. She had been at home that evening, preparing dinner for her 2 children, an alibi that her defense team struggled to corroborate. The store's security footage was grainy at best, but the prosecution had found their narrative. The shadowy figure in the video was a black woman, and that was enough for them to point the finger at Rachel. The evidence was flimsy. A partial fingerprint on a display case, inconclusive. Witnesses who claimed to have seen her near the scene, none of whom could provide a clear description. Yet the prosecution pressed on with confidence, knowing that public opinion was already against her. In the court of social judgment, Rachel was guilty the moment her mugshot hit the news. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man with an air of smug self-assurance, strutted across the courtroom like a performer on stage. He leaned into the stereotypes with every word he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice dripping with rehearsed conviction, "this case isn't just about theft. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their background or circumstances, thinks they can operate outside the law." His words landed like a slap, and Rachel could feel the weight of the jury's collective gaze settle on her. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout that she didn't do it, that she wasn't some stereotype. But she knew better. Her lawyer had warned her to remain composed, to appear cooperative, even as the prosecution painted her as a dangerous criminal. The courtroom itself felt like an extension of her punishment. The air was thick with tension, and every corner seemed designed to remind her of her place. The polished wood of the judge's bench gleamed under the fluorescent lights, towering over her like a symbol of an unyielding system. The flag in the corner, meant to represent justice for all, felt like a cruel joke. The jury, a sea of predominantly white faces, avoided her gaze. Except for one man in the back, who stared at her with thinly veiled disdain. It was clear they weren't here to give her the benefit of the doubt. They had come to see justice served, or what their version of justice looked like. Rachel's lawyer, a weary public defender named Anna Lewis, did her best to counter the prosecution's narrative. Anna was passionate, but Rachel could see the strain in her eyes, the uphill battle she faced every day defending clients who didn't have the luxury of money or privilege. "This case," Anna began, her voice steady but not without an edge of desperation, "is about more than just Rachel Watson. It's about a system that has already decided her guilt before the evidence has even been presented. Look closely, and you'll see that there's no concrete proof tying her to this crime. Only assumptions. Only prejudice." Rachel wanted to believe in Anna's words, but the oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom made it hard to hold on to hope. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of every glance and whispered word pressing down on her. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about surviving a system that saw her as guilty from the moment she walked into the room. And as the judge called the court to order, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this day would determine not just her fate, but her very existence. The courtroom fell silent as the door at the side of the judge's bench opened, and he entered. Judge Thomas Clark stepped forward with the measured gait of someone accustomed to the weight of authority. His dark robes swept behind him, and his face was set in an expression of calm professionalism. The rustle of papers ceased, and every head turned toward him, including Rachel's. Her heart skipped a beat as their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Rachel felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't just the intensity of his gaze, though that alone was enough to unnerve her. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. His face, framed by neatly trimmed hair now flecked with gray, looked familiar in a way that tugged at her memory, like a tune she couldn't recall but knew she had heard before. Judge Clark froze for a fraction of a second, so subtle that most of the courtroom likely didn't notice. But Rachel did. His hand, halfway to his gavel, hung in the air for just a moment longer than it should have. His gray-blue eyes, sharp and discerning, seemed to widen ever so slightly before he quickly masked his reaction. Rachel's pulse quickened. What was that? Recognition? Surprise? Fear? She couldn't tell, but the look in his eyes left her feeling exposed, as if he could see right through her. For a brief moment, it felt like the rest of the courtroom faded into the background, leaving just the two of them locked in a silent exchange neither could fully understand. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He settled into his chair and adjusted his glasses, his composure seemingly restored. But Rachel could sense something beneath the surface, an unease that he was trying to suppress. She noticed how his gaze avoided hers now, how his hand gripped the edge of his desk just a little too tightly. Rachel's mind raced. Do I know him? Why does he seem familiar? She tried to piece together fragments of her past, searching for any connection to the man sitting on the bench above her. But nothing came to mind. On the other side of the courtroom, Judge Clark was having a similar internal battle. His face remained stoic, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He knew her. He was sure of it. The curve of her cheekbones, the intensity in her dark eyes, it was all too familiar to ignore. But where had he seen her before? And why did the sight of her now, in this courtroom, bring a sharp pang of guilt that he couldn't explain? The realization hit him like a sudden downpour, unrelenting and impossible to ignore. Memories from decades ago began to stir, unbidden. A hot summer day. A schoolyard. Laughter echoing through the air. A young girl with a bright smile, her braided hair catching the sunlight. Could it really be her? He pushed the thought away, unwilling to let it take hold. It's not possible, he told himself. It can't be. Rachel noticed his hesitation during the formalities. His voice, usually firm and commanding, faltered slightly as he addressed the courtroom. This trial is now in session. The words were steady, but the pause before them betrayed him. The oppressive silence that had hung over the courtroom earlier now seemed to shift into something else, tension, confusion, and the faintest hint of something unspoken. Rachel didn't know why, but she suddenly felt as though this trial wasn't just about her anymore. She glanced at Judge Clark again, hoping for some kind of clue, but his expression was a mask of professionalism. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was just as unsettled as she was. The whispers in the gallery began again, the hum of speculation filling the room like static electricity. But Rachel was too preoccupied to notice. The judge's reaction had left her with more questions than answers. For the first time since her arrest, Rachel felt a spark of something unfamiliar, curiosity. Who was this man? And why did he look at her like she was more than just another defendant? As the prosecution began their opening statement, Rachel tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment, the way his eyes had lingered on hers, the way something unspoken passed between them. Neither of them could know it yet, but this brief exchange would set the stage for revelations that would change both of their lives forever. The courtroom faded into the background as Rachel's thoughts took her far from the heavy silence of the present. That glance from Judge Clark had stirred something deep within her, unearthing memories she hadn't revisited in years. Memories of a simpler time, before the harsh realities of life and injustice became her constant companions. She was 8 years old again, barefoot in the cracked streets of Willowridge, a neighborhood as vibrant as it was impoverished. The air was thick with the scent of summer, fried chicken from someone's kitchen, freshly cut grass, and the faint tang of the nearby river. The world back then was smaller, confined to the cluster of houses where families struggled but managed to create their own sense of community. Among the faded facades and overgrown yards, there was one face she always looked for: Tommy. Tommy wasn't like the other kids. He stood out, not just because he was white in a predominantly black neighborhood, but because he didn't seem to notice the difference. While other children stayed close to the lines drawn by their parents, white kids on one side, black kids on the other, Tommy crossed them without a second thought. Rachel smiled faintly, remembering how he would wait for her by the big oak tree at the end of the block every morning. He'd always bring something to share, a piece of candy, a battered comic book, or sometimes just a joke that made her laugh so hard her sides hurt. Racy, he'd call her, a nickname only he was allowed to use. You coming or what? They spent endless hours exploring the neighborhood together, their adventures ranging from the daring to the absurd. Climbing the rusting chain-link fence behind the old factory, wading knee-deep in the muddy creek, and staging imaginary battles with sticks as swords. To them, the world was an endless playground, and they were its kings and queens. Rachel remembered the day Tommy had first stood up for her. A group of older boys had tried to take the marbles her father had given her, a rare gift in a home where every penny was stretched thin. Tommy, small for his age but fearless, had charged at them with nothing but a rusty tin can lid he called his shield. You mess with her, you mess with me, he'd yelled, his voice cracking with determination. Rachel had never felt safer than she did at that moment. But even in their bubble of childhood innocence, the cracks of reality began to show. Rachel's parents often warned her to be careful around Tommy's family. His father worked at the local mill, a foreman known for his short temper and sharp tongue. That boy's nice, her mother would say, but don't you forget where you stand, Rachel. Folks like his daddy won't see you the same way he does. Rachel had brushed off the warnings then, too young to understand the weight behind them. But the day she finally did came like a thunderstorm, sudden and unrelenting. It was a summer afternoon, sticky with heat. Tommy had come running to her house, his face pale and his voice frantic. You gotta go, he said, grabbing her arm. My daddy saw us playing in the yard. He's real mad. She had never seen Tommy so scared, and it scared her too. She didn't ask questions, didn't wait to find out what his father might say or do. She just ran. That night, her mother sat her down, her voice heavy with sadness. Baby, I told you. Some people don't want us mixing. It's not fair, but it's the way it is. The next day, Tommy didn't wait for her by the oak tree. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The distance between them grew, and eventually, Rachel stopped looking for him. Sitting in the courtroom now, Rachel felt the weight of those lost years pressing down on her. The boy who had once been her fiercest defender was now the man seated on the judge's bench, his gavel a symbol of power in a system that had so often failed people like her. She wondered if he remembered. Did he think of the creek where they caught frogs, the tree they carved their initials into with a pocket knife? Did he regret the silence that had grown between them, or was she just another face in a long line of defendants to him now? As her gaze shifted back to Judge Clark, she saw the faintest flicker of something in his expression, a crack in the polished mask of authority he wore. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to make her wonder if the past had come rushing back for him, too. Rachel tightened her grip on the edge of the bench, grounding herself in the present. Whatever had happened between them as children didn't change the reality of her situation now. The boy she had once trusted was gone, replaced by a man who held her future in his hands. And she wasn't sure if she could count on him to remember the girl she used to be. Thomas Clark sat on the judge's bench, his face composed, his demeanor professional. But inside, he was wrestling with a storm of emotions. The sight of Rachel had shaken something deep within him, something he thought he had long since buried. For years, he had built a life on discipline and detachment, climbing the ranks of the justice system, only to have his carefully constructed world crack at the edges the moment their eyes met. Thomas had grown up in a world far removed from the struggles of Willow Ridge. The Clark family home sat in a neatly manicured neighborhood, a world of privilege and unspoken rules. His father, a respected factory foreman, believed in order, tradition, and knowing one's place in society. His mother, though gentler, had always been careful to keep her distance from the wrong kind of people. As a child, Thomas had been oblivious to these silent barriers. His friendship with Rachel had bloomed in innocence, untainted by the prejudices he would later inherit. For him, Rachel wasn't the black girl down the street. She was simply Racy, his partner in adventure, his fiercest ally. They were equals in his eyes, and the world beyond their little corner of Willow Ridge seemed too far away to matter. But that world began to close in as he grew older. His father, noticing how much time Tommy spent with Rachel, had put a firm hand on his shoulder one evening and said, "Son, it's time you start thinking about the kind of people you keep around. Folks talk. You don't want to give them the wrong impression." At first, Thomas resisted. He didn't understand what his father meant. But the warning grew sharper with each passing day, his father's disapproval louder, harsher. The tipping point came the day Thomas brought Rachel home. They had spent the afternoon racing through the creek, their laughter echoing through the woods. Mud streaked their clothes as they stumbled into the Clark kitchen, still giggling over who had slipped first. But the moment his father saw Rachel standing there, barefoot and grinning, the air turned icy. "What's she doing here?" his father barked, the question more accusation than inquiry. Thomas tried to explain, but his father's face darkened. "I told you, boy, this isn't how things are done. You think people won't notice? You think it doesn't matter? It does." That night, Thomas sat in his room, staring at the wall. He didn't understand why the world suddenly felt so much smaller, why something as simple as friendship had become a problem. But he understood one thing: his father's approval meant everything. And so, slowly, reluctantly, he began to pull away from Rachel. Years passed, and life carried Thomas further from the boy he once was. He excelled in school, earning scholarships and eventually a degree in law. The justice system called to him, its promise of order and fairness aligning with the values his father had drilled into him. But as he moved through the ranks, Thomas began to see the cracks in that promise. Cases piled on his desk, many of them involving people from neighborhoods like Willow Ridge. The statistics were undeniable: harsher sentences, biased evidence, systemic failures. But Thomas told himself that his job was not to question the system, only to uphold it. He had become a cog in the very machine that had pushed Rachel out of his life all those years ago. Now, sitting in the courtroom, he felt the weight of that realization pressing down on him. Seeing Rachel again had reopened wounds he didn't know he still carried. She was no longer the carefree girl from his childhood, but a woman sitting on trial, accused of crimes he wasn't sure she had committed. Thomas glanced at the case file in front of him, the words blurring as his mind drifted. The evidence felt thin, the accusations too convenient. Yet here she was, facing the full force of a system that he knew all too well was often anything but just. He thought of his father's voice, still echoing in his mind after all these years. "Stick to the rules, and you'll do fine. Don't go questioning things that don't concern you." But now, looking at Rachel, he couldn't help but question everything. How had he gone from being her protector to the man presiding over her trial? How had he let himself become the very symbol of the system that had torn them apart? Thomas clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the gavel. The courtroom was waiting for him to speak, to proceed with the case. But his heart was pounding, and the memories wouldn't let go. The boy who had stood by Rachel's side was still there, buried beneath years of conformity and ambition. And for the first time in decades, Thomas wondered if it was time to let that boy's voice be heard again. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension as the prosecutor, a man as polished as the marble floors beneath him, rose to deliver his case. His suit, crisp and immaculate, reflected the confidence of someone who had mastered the art of persuasion. Every gesture, every word seemed calculated to paint Rachel Watson not as a person, but as an archetype, the dangerous outsider, the threat to society. "This case," he began, his voice smooth but forceful, "is about accountability. It's about justice for those who have been wronged. Rachel Watson didn't just rob a jewelry store, she robbed a sense of safety and trust in this community." Rachel flinched inwardly at the words. She had heard them before, variations of the same rhetoric used to vilify people who looked like her. To the prosecutor, she wasn't Rachel, a mother, a daughter, an innocent woman. She was just another example, another statistic in a system eager to prove its toughness on crime. The evidence he presented was riddled with inconsistencies, but his delivery made it seem airtight. A partial fingerprint on a jewelry case was his first piece of proof. Never mind that it was smudged and incomplete, barely meeting the threshold for identification. The prosecutor spun it into a damning detail. "Her fingerprint," he declared, holding up a blown-up image for the jury to see, "was found at the scene of the crime. What more do we need to know?" Rachel's defense attorney, Anna Lewis, objected, pointing out that Rachel had never been inside that store and that partial prints were notoriously unreliable. But the prosecutor waved away the objection with a practiced air, returning his focus to the jury as if he were lecturing students on an open-and-shut case. Then came the witnesses. The store clerk, a young man barely out of high school, claimed to have seen Rachel near the store on the night of the robbery. His testimony was hesitant, filled with, "I think," and "I'm pretty sure," but the prosecutor leaned on him as though his words were gospel. "Can you describe the suspect you saw that night?" the prosecutor asked, his tone gentle, almost fatherly. "Well," the clerk stammered, "she was, black. Medium height. Hair kind of like," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely in Rachel's direction. The description was vague, generic, and could have applied to countless women. But the prosecutor seized on it as though it were a perfect match. "Thank you," he said, turning back to the jury. "I think we all know who this witness is describing." The jury shifted in their seats, some nodding slightly. Rachel's stomach churned. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, judging her, as though her very existence was proof of guilt. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't physical or testimonial, it was the narrative the prosecutor crafted around Rachel's identity. He didn't need to say it outright, his words were laced with insinuations, each one calculated to reinforce stereotypes. "She was desperate," he said at one point, pacing in front of the jury box. "Struggling to make ends meet, willing to do whatever it took. This crime wasn't just an act of theft, it was an act of survival." The implication hung in the air: Rachel's background, her economic status, her race, all of it was being used against her. The prosecutor didn't have to prove she committed the crime, he just had to convince the jury that someone like her could have done it. Rachel clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to shout, to stand up and demand they see her for who she was, not the caricature the prosecutor was painting. But she stayed silent, knowing any outburst would only play into his hands. Her defense attorney tried to fight back, pointing out the holes in the prosecution's case. She highlighted the lack of concrete evidence, the unreliable witnesses, the inconsistencies in the timeline. But the jury seemed more captivated by the prosecutor's confident narrative than by Anna's careful reasoning. The final blow came when the prosecutor addressed the jury directly, his voice heavy with mock sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, leaning on the rail of the jury box, "I know this isn't an easy case. None of us want to believe that someone like Ms. Watson could do something so brazen. But the facts are clear. The evidence doesn't lie. But the facts did lie. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses unreliable, the entire case built on assumptions and prejudice. Yet in that moment, Rachel felt the weight of the system bearing down on her, a machine designed to crush anyone who didn't fit its mold. As the prosecutor returned to his seat, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at his lips, Rachel felt a chill settle over her. The trial wasn't about finding the truth. It was about winning. And in this game, the odds were stacked against her from the start. The judge, Thomas Clark, looked down at Rachel briefly, his face unreadable. But she noticed the way his hand lingered on the edge of his gavel, the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Was it doubt? Regret? Or was he, too, resigned to the system's crushing inevitability? Rachel couldn't tell. But one thing was clear, this wasn't a trial about justice. It was a performance, and she was being cast as the villain. Rachel sat on the cold metal bench in the holding cell, her hands trembling in her lap. The walls around her, gray and lifeless, seemed to close in, amplifying every sound, the echo of footsteps, the jingle of keys, the distant murmur of voices. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, bathing everything in a sterile glow that felt suffocating. She had endured many things in her life, but nothing compared to the slow, soul-crushing humiliation she faced now. From the moment she was arrested, her dignity had been stripped away piece by piece, as though it was another crime to be punished for. The guards treated her like she was less than human. They called her Watson, in clipped, disdainful tones, never Ms. Watson, never with the smallest shred of respect. One particularly cruel guard, a burly man with a permanent sneer, had taken to calling her Princess in a mocking voice. "How's life in the palace, Princess?" he'd jeer whenever he walked by her cell. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the way they handled her, rough, indifferent, as if she were an object to be moved from one place to another. When they escorted her back to the holding area after each day in court, their hands gripped her arms too tightly, leaving faint bruises on her skin. Once, she stumbled on the uneven floor, and instead of helping her up, the guard smirked and muttered, "Figures." But the worst moments came during the strip searches. Every time she had to endure the invasive process, Rachel felt a piece of herself shatter. The guards acted like it was routine, like it was nothing, but to her, it was a constant reminder of how little she mattered to them. She wasn't a person in their eyes, she was just another number, another body in the system. Outside the jail, things weren't much better. The few times Rachel was transported, shackled and escorted in public, she could feel the stares. People on the street didn't see a wrongfully accused woman, they saw a criminal. Mothers pulled their children closer, whispers followed her like shadows, and some people didn't even bother to hide their disgust. "Bet she did it," one man muttered loudly as she was led past him. "Look at her. They always do." Rachel kept her head down, but her ears burned. Every comment felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't know her, but what was the point? The system had already decided her story, and they believed it. The hardest part wasn't the physical humiliation or the public scorn. It was the isolation. Rachel's family couldn't afford to visit often, and when they did, the conversations were strained. Her mother's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, her voice trembling as she said, "We're praying for you, baby. We're doing everything we can." Her children, too young to fully understand, looked at her with confusion and fear. "When are you coming home, Mommy?" her youngest had asked during their last visit. Rachel had forced a smile and said, "Soon, baby. Mommy's coming home soon." But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. At night, in the silence of her cell, Rachel wrestled with her thoughts. Doubt crept in like a cold draft, whispering questions she didn't want to face. What if they never believe me? What if this is my life now? But even in her darkest moments, Rachel clung to something fragile yet unyielding, her dignity. The system could strip her of her clothes, her freedom, even her reputation, but it couldn't take her sense of self unless she let it. She began to fight back in small, quiet ways. When the guards mocked her, she refused to respond. When she was paraded through the streets, she held her head high, daring anyone to meet her gaze. When she was alone in her cell, she whispered affirmations to herself, reminding herself of who she was, a mother, a daughter, a woman who deserved better than this. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in court, Rachel sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the faint graffiti carved into the wall. Among the crude drawings and profanities, one phrase stood out, "This too shall pass." She traced the words with her finger, feeling a flicker of hope. Rachel wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't let them break her. Not entirely. No matter how much the system tried to crush her, she would hold on to the small, stubborn flame inside her. Because that flame was hers, and they could never take it away. Judge Thomas Clark sat in his chambers, the faint hum of the courthouse a constant reminder of the trial unfolding just outside his door. The case file sat open on his desk, the pages filled with reports, testimonies, and evidence he had read a dozen times. Yet, for all the words staring back at him, none of them felt like the truth. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the small window in the corner of the room. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the walls, the golden light doing little to chase away the shadows in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, not just the defendant in the courtroom, but the girl he once knew. The memories had started to resurface the moment he saw her face. At first, they were fleeting, vague impressions of laughter, sunlight, and summer days. But as the trial progressed, they became clearer, more vivid. He remembered the way she used to race him to the oak tree at the edge of the block, her laughter ringing out like music. He remembered how she always stood up for him when the older kids teased him for being small, her voice fierce and unwavering. He also remembered the day he let her down. It was a hot summer afternoon, and they had been playing near the creek, their usual escape from the watchful eyes of their parents. Rachel had found an old pocketknife buried in the mud, and they had spent hours carving their initials into the bark of the oak tree. It was their tree, their secret. But that evening, his father had found out. Thomas could still hear his voice, sharp and cold. "You can't keep running around with her, Tommy. People are starting to talk." Thomas hadn't understood at first. "Why does it matter? She's my friend." His father's response had been curt, final. "Because it's not right. You're not like her, and she's not like us. You need to know your place." Those words had stayed with him, shaping the decisions he made as he grew older. He had pushed Rachel away, not because he wanted to, but because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. And now, decades later, here she was, sitting in his courtroom, her life in his hands. Thomas rubbed his temples, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wanted to believe in the system he had dedicated his life to, the system that promised justice for all. But the more he examined Rachel's case, the more he saw its flaws. The evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. The witnesses were unreliable, their testimonies laced with bias. And yet, the prosecution was building a narrative that felt almost impossible to dismantle. Was she guilty? His instincts told him no, but instincts weren't enough. As a judge, he was supposed to rely on facts, on the letter of the law. But what if the law wasn't enough? What if the system he had spent his entire career upholding was just as flawed as the people within it? He thought about the prosecutor, slick and self-assured, his arguments dripping with insinuations that played on the jury's prejudices. Thomas had seen it before, how easily a case could turn into a performance, a spectacle designed to manipulate rather than reveal the truth. And yet, he had allowed it to happen. Why hadn't he spoken up? Why hadn't he challenged the prosecutor's tactics or questioned the flimsy evidence? The answer was one he didn't want to admit: fear. Thomas had spent his life walking a tightrope, balancing his personal beliefs with the expectations of the world around him. He had risen through the ranks of the judiciary by staying neutral, by avoiding controversy, by never stepping too far out of line. But now, faced with Rachel's case, he was beginning to question whether neutrality was just another word for complicity. He glanced at the photograph on his desk, a picture of his wife and 2 sons taken on a sunny day at the beach. They were his world, his reason for everything he did. But even as he looked at their smiling faces, he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind. What kind of example am I setting for them if I don't do what's right? Thomas sighed, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, doubt, and responsibility. He knew that whatever decision he made would come at a cost. If he stood up for Rachel, he risked his reputation, his career, and the respect of his peers. But if he stayed silent, if he allowed the system to crush her under its weight, he risked losing something far more important: his humanity. As the light outside faded into dusk, Thomas made his way back to the courtroom. The trial wasn't over, and there was still time to make a difference. But as he took his seat on the bench, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, one that would define not just Rachel's future, but his own. The gavel felt heavier in his hand than it ever had before. Thomas Clark sat at his desk, the sound of the courtroom fading into a distant hum. He stared at his hands, now speckled with the signs of age, but in his mind, they weren't the hands of a judge. They were the hands of a boy gripping a worn baseball, tossing it lazily back and forth with a girl whose laughter echoed in his ears even now. Rachel. The name felt heavy in his chest, carrying the weight of memories he had tried to leave behind. Seeing her in court had unlocked a door he'd kept firmly shut for years, and now the memories poured out like a flood he couldn't stop. They were inseparable once, he and Rachel. She had been the kind of friend who made everything feel bigger, brighter, more alive. They explored the woods behind their neighborhood, chased fireflies at dusk, and made grand plans for adventures they'd never take. To him, Rachel was fearless, the one who always dared to climb higher, run faster, push further. But there had been shadows in their world, shadows he hadn't fully understood as a child. He remembered the way his mother would frown whenever Rachel came over, her voice tight as she asked, "Doesn't she have her own place to play?" He remembered the warnings his father gave him, laced with words he didn't understand at the time but would later come to recognize as prejudice. "You're a Clark, Tommy," his father had said one evening, his tone as sharp as the crease in his freshly ironed shirt. "And Clarks don't mix with people like her. It's not right. It's not how things are done." Thomas had argued, his young voice trembling with the effort of standing up to the man he idolized. "But she's my friend." His father's response had been cold, final. "Friends like that will only drag you down." At first, Thomas had tried to ignore his father's words, but the pressure was relentless. It wasn't just his family. The kids at school, the neighbors, even the casual glances from strangers, all of it seemed to reinforce the same unspoken rule: Rachel didn't belong in his world, and he didn't belong in hers. The day their friendship ended was burned into his memory with painful clarity. They had been playing near the creek, their favorite spot. Rachel had found a tattered piece of red fabric and tied it around her head like a bandana, declaring herself the captain of their imaginary pirate ship. Thomas had laughed, but the sound had caught in his throat when he saw his father standing on the bank, watching them with a stony expression. "What are you doing here?" his father had barked, his eyes fixed on Rachel. Rachel, unbothered, had grinned and said, "We're pirates, sir. Want to join the crew?" But his father wasn't amused. He grabbed Thomas by the arm, pulling him away so roughly that he stumbled. "Get home. Now." Rachel had called after him, confusion and hurt in her voice. "Tommy? What's going on?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, his father sat him down at the kitchen table. "You're not to see her again," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't have people thinking my son doesn't know his place." Thomas had nodded, his head bowed, his chest heavy with shame. He didn't know what hurt more, his father's words or the way he had obeyed them without question. The next day, he avoided the oak tree where they usually met. When Rachel came knocking on his door, he hid in his room, pretending not to hear. And when she finally stopped coming around, he told himself it was for the best. But it wasn't. As he grew older, Thomas carried the weight of that decision like a stone in his pocket. He buried himself in his studies, excelling in school, then college, then law school. He told himself he was doing what he had to do, that he was following the path laid out for him. But every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of something that reminded him of Rachel, a laugh, a flash of braided hair, the sound of someone calling out a name that sounded like hers, and the guilt would rise up, sharp and unrelenting. Now, sitting in his chambers with her case file in front of him, Thomas felt that guilt more acutely than ever. Rachel was no longer the girl from the creek, but a woman fighting for her freedom in a system that had already decided her worth. And he was the one presiding over her trial, the one with the power to tip the scales. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He could still see her as she had been that day at the creek, her eyes bright, her smile unbroken. And he could see her now, sitting in the courtroom, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady despite the weight pressing down on her. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to confront the question he had avoided for so long: what kind of man did I become when I turned away from my friend? The answer wasn't one he liked. And as he opened his eyes, he knew that whatever decision he made in this trial, it wouldn't just be about Rachel. It would be about the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the kind of person he wanted to be. The courtroom was electric with tension as the defense attorney, Anna Lewis, stood and faced the jury. The trial had dragged on for weeks, each day chipping away at Rachel's hope as the prosecution built a narrative so steeped in bias that it felt insurmountable. But today, Anna's determination seemed different, sharper, more resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency, "today, I will show you why the case against Rachel Watson is not only weak but fundamentally flawed. This is not just about her innocence. This is about a system that has failed her from the very beginning." Rachel, seated at the defense table, felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. For the first time since her arrest, she sensed that the tide might be turning. Anna began by revisiting the prosecution's key piece of evidence, the partial fingerprint. She called an independent forensic expert to the stand, a wiry man with sharp eyes and an air of authority. "Mr. Carson," Anna said, "you've reviewed the fingerprint analysis presented by the prosecution. What did you find?" Carson adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "The fingerprint in question is incomplete and of extremely poor quality. In my professional opinion, it is not sufficient to definitively match to any individual, let alone Ms. Watson." The prosecutor leaped to his feet, objecting that the witness was undermining the credibility of law enforcement. But Judge Thomas Clark raised a hand, silencing him. "Overruled," he said, his voice firm. "Proceed." Thomas's tone was calm, but inside, he felt a growing unease. The prosecution had leaned heavily on that fingerprint, presenting it as irrefutable proof of Rachel's guilt. But now, hearing the expert's testimony, he couldn't ignore the cracks in their case. Anna pressed on. "So, in essence, the fingerprint is inconclusive?" "Correct," Carson replied. Anna turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "Inconclusive. Yet the prosecution presented it as definitive. Think about that." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Anna wasn't finished. She moved on to the witnesses. One by one, she exposed the inconsistencies in their testimonies. The store clerk, who had confidently identified Rachel as the suspect, was forced to admit under cross-examination that he had only seen the alleged perpetrator for a few seconds, and from a distance. Another witness admitted that they had been influenced by media reports, which had prominently featured Rachel's mugshot. "Is it possible," Anna asked, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade, "that you formed your opinion of Ms. Watson based on her photograph, rather than your actual memory of that night?" The witness hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. "It's possible." Rachel's heart pounded as she watched the jury's expressions shift. Some looked uncertain, others thoughtful. The wall of bias that had seemed impenetrable was beginning to crack. But the real turning point came when Anna presented a piece of evidence the prosecution hadn't expected: surveillance footage from a nearby business. The footage showed a shadowy figure entering the jewelry store at the time of the robbery. The figure's height and build were noticeably different from Rachel's. "This footage," Anna said, her voice rising with conviction, "was available to law enforcement but was never included in their investigation." "Why?" "Because it didn't fit their narrative." The prosecutor tried to object, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Thomas leaned forward, his brows furrowing. The omission of such critical evidence was troubling. As he watched the footage, he couldn't help but question the integrity of the investigation. Anna's closing argument was a masterstroke. She didn't just defend Rachel, she attacked the system that had put her on trial. "Rachel Watson is not a criminal," she said, her voice ringing out across the silent courtroom. "She is a victim of a system that too often sees guilt where it should see humanity. This trial isn't just about her innocence. It's about whether we, as a society, are willing to accept a system that prioritizes prejudice over truth." As Anna returned to her seat, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Even the jury seemed unsettled, their expressions reflecting the weight of her words. Thomas sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent his career believing in the justice system, but now, faced with the reality of Rachel's case, he couldn't deny the flaws staring him in the face. The evidence was weak. The witnesses were unreliable. And the prosecution's narrative reeked of bias. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight of his gavel like a chain. His decision would shape not just Rachel's future, but his own understanding of what justice truly meant. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, one thing was clear: the fight for Rachel's freedom had become a fight for the soul of the very system he had sworn to uphold. The courtroom was silent as Judge Thomas Clark took a deep breath and looked out over the room. The trial had been long and grueling, but now it was time to speak. He tapped the gavel lightly, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Before this jury delivers its verdict, I must address something deeper than the facts of this case," he began, his gaze moving between Rachel and the jury. "This trial has exposed more than the guilt or innocence of the defendant. It has revealed the flaws in a system that too often allows prejudice to shape justice." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "The evidence against Rachel Watson is weak, the witnesses unreliable, and yet she was brought here because assumptions were made, assumptions rooted not in fact but in bias. This is not justice, and we cannot allow it to stand." The jury shifted in their seats, their expressions a mixture of shock and realization. Thomas's voice grew firmer. "It is the duty of this court to ensure fairness, to rise above prejudice. Based on the facts presented, it is clear Rachel Watson is not guilty." The jury retired briefly and returned with their unanimous verdict: not guilty. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, tears streaming down her face. The gallery erupted, half in relief, half in disbelief. For the first time, Rachel felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. After the courtroom emptied, Thomas asked to meet Rachel in private. Standing face to face, he removed the mask of authority he had worn throughout the trial. "Rachel," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I owe you more than an apology. I turned away from you when we were kids because I was scared of what people would think, scared of going against the grain. I see now how wrong I was." Rachel studied him for a moment before speaking. You can't change the past, Thomas. But today, you chose truth over fear. That matters. They parted with a quiet understanding, the pain of the past softened by the hope of a better future. Rachel's victory became more than just her own, it was a spark for change, a reminder that courage could challenge even the deepest injustices. What do you think of Rachel and Thomas's story? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.